these elections are not just technically an issue, they're also morally just an issue. It's indefensible what the junta is doing.
Hello and welcome to episode 48 of What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. It's Friday, October 10, and today we have another take on the military's so-called elections, scheduled for the end of this year. We'll be joined by two speakers behind a new report on the elections released last week by the Asian Network for Free Elections, that's ANFREL. They are Amaël Vier, who is an election consultant and analyst, as well as Tharindu Abeyrathna, the Senior Program Officer for Campaign and Advocacy at ANFREL. First, though, a quick announcement. Frontier Myanmar has appointed a new Chief Executive Officer to take over from founder Sonny Sui after his decade at the helm. Aung Tin Aung is the new CEO. He's a Myanmar-born American citizen with a wealth of business experience. This is a really terribly difficult time for independent media, journalism, not just reporting on Myanmar, but increasingly right across the world, with pressures coming from multiple directions, technological, political. We look forward to Aung Tin Aung making an impression at Frontier. And you can read the full announcement and ownership disclosures through the link in the show notes. Now, on to some news before hearing from our speakers. This week marked the Thadingyut holiday, widely considered the second most important holiday in the Myanmar calendar year. For the first time since the coup, the famous Yijaw festivities went ahead in military-controlled Yangon, with evening fun fairs, street food, games and activities. Meanwhile, in resistance-controlled Bondo village, Chaung-U township, which is only 10 kilometres or so south of Monua town, well there, the Myanmar military bombed a riverside candlelit vigil, being attended by hundreds of people. Many there were commemorating not only the Buddhist holiday, but also their continued rejection of military rule. A paramotor carried out the attack on the peaceful gathering, using several bombs to kill at least 40 people, including many children, and injuring over 80 others. A witness said that about one-third of the hundreds-strong crowd managed to flee, but, and I quote, children were completely torn apart. The incoming paramotor was difficult to spot. It was night, and it was also difficult to hear over the loud Buddhist prayers that were blaring from loudspeakers at the event. As covered in Frontier's Political Insider newsletter back in March, the military has been using paramotors to carry out airstrikes since late last year, and resistance groups in central Myanmar largely lack the firepower to shoot them down. Elsewhere, the military marked this week of the Thadingyut with other airstrikes across northern Shan State and in Mandalay region. All told, on first count, this holiday week, the military's air force indiscriminately killed over 54 adults and children and injured over 100. Resistance forces did not sit idly by, however, with several clashes and conflict theatres heating up this week. It's too much to cover in detail. But a People's Defence Force in Gani Township launched a surprise attack on military soldiers and police on patrol on Wednesday, killing 7 of them. The military responded by firing artillery all Thursday and deploying drones, but the PDF said no one was hurt from the routine retaliation. Also on Wednesday, the Kachin Independence Army, KIA, took control of 2 military outposts in Waimor Township, where fighting has been raging back and forth for over 2 months. Territory has changed hands fast in Waimor, back and forth, but overall, the military has struggled to recapture much territory from the KIA since the KIA's string of victories beginning in March last year. Fighting this week also continued in Pakan and Bamor. Now, moving to the elections. As covered in Frontier's daily briefing newsletter, which was sent to members on Wednesday, the chair of the military proxy Union Solidarity and Development Party's branch in Naypyidaw, Tha Sui, he claimed this week that voter lists released by the military's Union Election Commission, the UEC, have hundreds of errors and outdated data. The UEC began displaying preliminary voter lists on September 30. It's worth remembering here that the military's justification for cancelling the results of the 2020 elections and launching the coup, well, the justification was the allegation that voter lists were plagued with irregularities. This is ironic. E Lwin, chair of the Union of Myanmar Federal National Politics, told media outlet Democratic Voice of Burma this week, quote, "We're in constant conflict with the UEC. There have been mistakes and errors ever since the beginning of the preparations for this election." And he added that the UEC has said it will only fix the errors, quote, later. The military, of course, bans criticism of the election, and on Saturday it claimed that since July 29, a total of 64 people have been prosecuted under the new military's election protection law. Some resistance groups are already destroying the copies of voter lists that the UEC has put up around the country. The UEC seems undaunted, however. This week it launched ceremonies across the country on Tuesday to unveil election awareness billboards. These ceremonies were held in parts of Bago, Magwe, Ayeyarwady, Sagaing and Mandalay regions, as well as Shan and Kachin State. The UEC urged citizens to check their names on its voter lists, quote, without fail. And as the elections get closer, and we understand more and more, better and better, just how they are going to work, we have the Asian Network for Free Elections, ANFREL, launching its assessment report on the elections. This report really helps point out, step by step, the many ways that these military so-called elections fall short. It's a report that can be and should be pointed to for its breadth and thoroughness, and hopefully will be read by anyone entertaining the idea that the military's elections are in any way a step forward for the crisis-riven country of Myanmar. I'm delighted to be able to speak to two of the people behind that report on the show today. Amaël Vier, an election consultant and analyst, and Tharindu Abeyrathna, Senior Program Officer for Campaign and Advocacy at ANFREL. Hello, Amaël. Thank you for coming on the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And greetings, Tharindu. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for inviting us.
Okay, Tharindu, maybe we could start with you. For any listeners who are unfamiliar, could you maybe quickly introduce the Asian Network for Free Elections and its work, its involvement in trying to assist the institutionalization of democracy in Myanmar over time?
ANFREL stands for Asian Network for Free Elections. We are a regional network covering 28 citizen election observation organizations across 18 Asian countries. And we have our secretariat based in Bangkok, Thailand. ANFREL's main objective is to conduct international election observation across Asia. We are the only organization in Asia signed the Declaration of Principles for International Election Observation. Apart from the international election observation, we also involved in capacity building for citizen observer groups and also the electoral reforms across the region. We have been engaged with Myanmar stakeholders and pro-democracy activities for almost 2 decades right now, in different capacities like election observation, capacity building, and also advocacy for campaigning and advocacy for electoral reforms. We had a few capacity building programs from 2013 to 2021 until the military coup. Apart from that, ANFREL also observed 2015 and 2020 general elections formally with the accreditation from Union Election Commission, also 2017 and 2018 by-elections. So overall, I think ANFREL is the only organization that conduct international election observation throughout the entire electoral cycle from 2015 to 2020. So yeah, that's about ANFREL.
Cheers, Tharindu. And of course, ANFREL assesses elections according to established international standards and best practices for genuine democratic elections. This new report that we're talking about, which of course again is linked in the show notes, I'll quote it. It says, "Elections staged by the junta in Myanmar do not align with international standards and cannot be considered credible or legitimate." Turning to you, Amaël, so what are these international standards? What are the reasons why these elections are not credible or legitimate? Thank you.
Of course, thank you for asking this. As we highlighted in the report's executive summary, and that's a direct quotation, the junta's elections will take place in an environment of widespread violence, restrictive laws, and intense repression, and will feature dubious electronic voting machines, hand-picked political parties, and no independent scrutiny from media or civil society. To break it down a bit further, some of the key findings that we found in the report are a crackdown on fundamental rights since the coup, including freedoms of expression, assembly, association, the right to information, and the right to political participation. B, a climate of insecurity and rampant violence against civilians, which means that people in Myanmar don't enjoy freedom from fears. C, an electoral framework, both legal and institutional, implemented by the junta with little to no input from external stakeholders. D, a lack of genuine political competition. E, a lack of transparency and questionable integrity of the elections, including, as mentioned previously, the voting machines. And finally, no independent oversight from Myanmar civil society, from media, and from genuine election observers. So you can see among the issues that I've mentioned that some pertain to the environment in which the elections will take place, while others are of a more political or technical nature. Overall, however, the assessments that we have produced is that these elections staged by the junta do not comply either with Myanmar's obligations with regard to human rights and international law, nor with internationally recognized standards for free, fair, and genuine elections.
That is a terrific and succinct summary. Thank you, Amaël. Now I want to switch the frame of reference a little bit. How would you then assess these elections, not so much in reference to those international standards, best practices, aspirations that you mentioned, but maybe rather in a more limited way, like within the region? How would these Myanmar military elections compare with other elections in other countries in the region, or even the practices of other regimes that may not be democracies, the ones that ANFREL focuses on and has expertise on? Thanks.
Thank you. So to answer that, first I want to preface by saying that it's always difficult to draw direct comparisons between one country and another because elections don't occur in a vacuum. There is a history they're based on, there's an environment, there's a culture. So we tend to refrain from doing those direct side-by-side comparisons, but in this case, it's probably helpful for the listeners. So I'll give it a shot. Again, painting with very broad strokes. As we know, it's difficult, and Southeast Asia in particular is a very diverse region. However, if we paint the region as a spectrum, on one end of the spectrum, you have one-party authoritarian state in Laos and Vietnam that are very much not democracies, nor do they pretend to be democracies. You also have Cambodia, authoritarian state that has become increasingly repressive, that has used courts and laws to suppress dissent, media, and opposition parties. You have Singapore, which is not truly democracy, that has some degree of liberalization and political competitiveness. However, they also have some of the world's most gerrymandered elections, and that has enabled a single party to hold power since the country's independence. And then on the other half of the spectrum, you have more democratic countries. Malaysia, that would include Indonesia and the Philippines. Those countries have a history of genuine elections and changes of government, but they also face challenges with corruption and factionalism. At the democratic end of the spectrum, you also find Timor-Leste, which is the youngest country in the region and soon to be the next member of ASEAN. Timor-Leste, despite its size and economic challenges, has shown stably genuine elections, has embraced democratic practices, and has seen peaceful transitions of power since its independence. So you have more or less two poles, should I say. And then you have Thailand and Myanmar. Both of them are outliers in the region because of the continued meddling of their militaries in politics. Obviously at different levels, because the people in Thailand enjoy a much higher degree of freedom and quality of life. But Thailand's democratic development has been repeatedly stunted over the years by military coups, 13 of them since 1932, and today the military remains a key player in politics. Elections in Thailand are usually technically sound, but not necessarily competitive or meaningful, and that's still true today. Myanmar, on the other hand, when it began its democratic transition around 2011, the period from 2011 to 2020, Myanmar made great strides towards democratic governance with the 2015 and 2020 general elections that were generally recognized as credible. But there was still a long way to go to fulfill the people's democratic aspirations. However, as we know, following the 2020 elections, the Tatmadaw, the armed forces of Myanmar, were unwilling to let go of power, so they staged the coup and they set back the country by at least a decade, if not more. Today, the country sits at the bottom of every freedom or democracy index in the region, and there is no chance that the junta's staged elections will change this. And these elections, despite the junta framing them as an exit strategy, a way forward, are very much not that. When you talk to diversity of people in Myanmar and outside as we have, these elections are not perceived as credible, transparent, inclusive. So I think that's a brief overview.
Yeah, and I know that there is a lot of research behind this report, a lot of interviews and discussions, things like that. Tharindu, I can see that you would like to add something.
Yeah, if I may add something like so whenever we conduct election observation or international election observation or assessment for an election environment, so we mainly look at two parts. The first one is the domestic law, and then the second one is the international and regional standards. So first one, the domestic law, we looked at whether this election process adhere to the locally the constitution and then the locally made election laws. And then the second one, we compare with the international standards, whether it's adhere to the internationally recognized and then the regionally recognized election standards. But if you talk about this particular junta planned election, so this election is not adhere to both of these. So it does not adhere to the military, their own military draft 2008 constitution or the election laws, and also not the international standards we talked about when it comes to elections. So I think that's also worth to mention about it.
Thank you, Tharindu. So these so-called elections fail on both those parts. That's important to keep in mind. I want to ask Amaël now about the political parties that are contesting this election, because as you mentioned before, there are, autocratic one-party states that don't allow other political parties to contest elections in Southeast Asia. However, these elections will have several parties contesting. And I also want to ask, though, has the Myanmar military essentially stitched up this process? Has it rigged the laws, the locations, the circumstances of these so-called elections so that a Union Solidarity and Development Party / military victory is assured? Is there no room for chance here or small parties achieving victories which lead to political change of any small kind?
I think the word perform that you mentioned, I think is very important. These are elections designed by the junta for the junta, administered by junta appointees. So throughout the process, there is favoritism towards the military-affiliated parties, which is mostly the USDP, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, but not only. And you can see this in many ways. For instance, you have the political party registration law, which required every party to be registered in 2023 under the military appointed, and I would add illegally appointed, Union Election Commission, or UEC. The result was that 40 political parties, including the then ruling NLD, National League for Democracy, were disbanded because they either did not want to register, or they knew that they would simply not meet the requirements or the oversight from the junta's UEC. The Election Commission also exercises strict oversight and is both judge and jury regarding who can compete in the elections. So that means even some parties that were registered actually saw their registration taken away from them in early September. You have, for instance, the National Democratic Force, the LDF, which was one of few parties registered countrywide. The LDF claimed to have 80,000 members, which was more than the required minimum of 50,000. However, the UEC still disbanded them, claiming that they did not meet the requirements. And so we don't really know what the truth is there. That you can see even parties that were co-opted, that agree with the junta's narrative around the election, that actually wanted to compete, they equal an oversight and they can be eliminated before the election at any time. Also after the election, because these elections will be over a month and there will be weeks after for the results, for the establishment of parliament. The UEC's powers are quite extensive, and at any time, basically, they can reduce the playing field. If anybody registered they don't like, they can still take away their voting right or the right to stand for election. And that's true in many aspects. I also want to mention briefly the complex electoral system that was introduced in the regime's revised election laws. This heavily favors large parties over smaller ones, which again benefits mostly the USDP, because that party has the most resources, enjoys the support from the military establishment, and has been able to campaign for months, even before the elections were held. Of course, you have the election protection law, which penalizes very harshly any criticism of the elections, of the election commission or the junta. So freedom of speech in the campaign will be very limited. You technically have 57 parties standing for election, but only 6 of them nationwide. And even for those parties, what they can say on the campaign trail or in media and social media is very limited. So you may have technically a diversity of parties. That does not mean you have a diversity of choices. A lot of that is a manufactured choice for voters. So the political competitiveness, as we mentioned, is not there. It's not a genuine election in terms of political alternatives. I also want to address the point on locations. That's a very important point and one that's difficult to assess just now because the locations, the real details of where the elections will be held, that will come to light really around election day. So we know that some townships have been called for phase 1 of the elections on December 28th. However, it's important to point out that there's no legal requirement for elections to be held in the entire township or constituency. So the military can actually hold elections only in urban areas or areas that they control or that they know is more favorable to them. That's something we've seen in previous elections in limited townships where there was conflict. That's something that we call partial cancellations. So the election commission will have, for instance, a half of a township, but the result is still count for the entire township because that's the way the law works. And that's something that the consensus among pro-democracy stakeholders is that will be utilized by the military to manufacture elections in greater areas than what they actually control. So you can have townships like Thadingyut State, for instance, where the junta does not control the entire township. A lot of the township is controlled by resistance forces, but the military can hold their elections in urban areas, and they can also use internally displaced people from Chin State in other areas of the country, get them to vote for their hometown, and in a way they can manufacture results that don't really match the reality on the ground. I'll just add a final thing. The military's victory is pretty much taken for granted that the USDP will win the election, as well as with the 25% of seats that are still reserved for military appointees in all of the country's parliaments. But even if USDP does not win, you have other parties that are more or less co-opted by the military. So you may have at the local level arrangements for USDP to not run, and in exchange it could be an acting party that would get the seats, because something that the junta desperately wants is some degree of token representation in the next parliament. They're not aiming for 100% USDP parliament because they know the optics of that. So you have 57 parties, you need to give some breadcrumbs to parties that actually have accepted to run in the elections. But in terms of substantive democracy, in terms of political alternative, little to none in truth.
Okay, Amaël, and while you're running hot, another part of the ANFREL report that I think is quite valuable is the helpful section on the electronic voting machines that the Myanmar military plans to use. I think that we can say that the technology is from India, and in India these machines were phased in over a period of decades, gaining acceptance for use there, but that's not what's happening here in Myanmar. So these machines are old technology, they're not connected to the internet. What else do we know about them?
I think in terms of assessment that ANFREL has produced on these machines, there's 2 key points. One is the adoption. As you mentioned, in India, that was adopted over 3 decades, more or less, with test phases, and then it was rolled out in more and more states before it was used nationwide. And all throughout that process, there was consultation of stakeholders, because there were people who didn't like the machines, who wanted to see more safeguards implemented or more features to ensure transparency. On the other hand, the junta in Myanmar has done none of that. In 2023, they said, okay, here's the prototype. That's what we're going to be using. Get used to it, basically. It very much looks like the technology is from India, even though the junta claims that these are Myanmar manufactured, but there are 99% carbon copies of what's being used in India. It's actually not high-tech at all. It's pretty low technology. It's for microcomputer boards, a battery, a printer. It's pretty simple. The issue is with the software and with the transparency, because international standards dictate that when you use electronic means of voting, which can be voting machines like we have here in Myanmar, or can be vote counting machines as we have in other countries, the onus is to have more transparency, not less transparency. And so the convergence in Myanmar, they have both less transparency and a new method of voting is very concerning. We know that there will not be any access to the source code for political parties, for civil society, for media. So the whole transmission phase after people cast their ballots, we don't have access to that. So the result that will be announced, there is no traceability down to the polling station level. There's no granularity of data available. That's usually what we look for. So we really have a whole blind spot on the process after the voting. And as to why the junta is doing that is very difficult to determine intent, but that might be a key reason why they will want to do this, to ensure no transparency. You could also make arguments that logistically it might be easier to have those machines that you can store ahead of time and then just activate on election day. Due to the conflict, you could make the argument that carrying ballot papers that are different across the country, so you have to print them, you have to dispatch them in a very tight timeline, that can be an argument. However, I wouldn't think that's the primary reason. I think the primary reason is simply that, again, this is a display. This is not genuine democracy. So this is a display for the consumption of the international community. And these machines allow for more control. And we've talked to political parties that will compete in these elections. They were both very misinformed on what those machines are and how they operate. And as well as they had their own concerns as well. Like they don't really understand, voters don't know how this works. So in a true democracy, this would have been implemented in a very different manner, together with voter education, teaching political parties so that the information can trickle down to the people. It's just all very peculiar to look upon externally.
Yes, it is peculiar to look upon externally, probably internally as well. Now, keeping with India, actually, I want to ask a question here. Of course, China and India, the two huge neighbours bordering Myanmar, will both likely support these election results. Something from India, though, that might be a little bit unexpected is that it's planning on sending election observers to Myanmar. Of course, India prides itself on being the world's largest democracy. It wants to be a robust democracy, even though there are some authoritarian elements in the system and current personalities and leaders, of course. Do you think, though, that if India does send observers to Myanmar to this election, will it face any criticism internationally or domestically? I mean, essentially, India would be going out of its way to voluntarily rubber stamp a military dictatorship that's killing, dozens of civilians, sometimes hundreds of civilians every week.
I would be surprised if the international community would really react strongly to this, given that India and Myanmar have been cooperating for years. However, there's a bit of irony in India stating that they want to send observers when India does not allow international observers in India. First of all, that's a practice that they haven't accepted domestically. They have civil society groups that provide feedback, that can observe to some extent, but international election observation is not something they do themselves. Then it will also be interesting to see whether India sends observers in their own name, meaning these are observers from India, or they will use the conduit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And I think that's maybe a more likely scenario. So this SCO body is quite an important regional body because you have Russia, Belarus, China, India are all members. Myanmar, I think, wants to accede to SCO membership. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization does send election observers in a lot of countries. No, these do not have an established methodology. They are mostly seen as rubber stampers. I have personally seen some of those observers in Central Asia where I was observing, and we would have a questionnaire, would stay a length of time. We'd actually have a checklist and an established methodology complying with the Declaration of Principle, which regulates action and observation. SCO does none of that. In my very anecdotal evidence, there people just came in, they signed a logbook, they took a few pictures, and they move on to the next one. They were also very quick to issue a statement. They usually issue a statement within 24 hours of election day taking place, which is quicker than most election observers do. And statements are most of the time overwhelmingly positive. And I also want to bring in the example of Cambodia. There are a lot of election observers in Cambodia, especially in 2018. There were thousands of them, mostly domestic. However, a lot of them were co-opted by the Cambodian government because civil society freedom was really cracked down upon. And they're not the only ones. We've seen that in other authoritarian regimes, from Russia to Venezuela to Zimbabwe, where now authoritarian regimes often see the need to stage elections and the need to stage election observation because those are core components of democratization in many countries. So again, they will be called observers. They will not be credible, genuine observers with an independent methodology. And the final point, even if you have election observers in Myanmar, civil society organizations, they cannot say anything negative. Election protection law means you cannot criticize elections. So again, the preconditions to provide even constructive feedback is not there. Everything I can say is only positive things. What's the purpose, truly?
All right, there's plenty to think through there. Thank you for that response. Interesting also to hear your anecdote about the SCO as observers. Now pivoting to a question about ASEAN Tharindu. Of course, ANFREL has broad comparative and regional expertise on elections in Southeast Asia and Asia. And of course, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations has been leading, though ineffectually, the response to the political crisis in Myanmar since 2021. So directly, do you imagine that ASEAN is going to accept by consensus these election results? If not, how could this be the end of the 5-point consensus? Will there be any change from ASEAN's point of view, do you think, following these so-called elections?
Yeah, I think we should not expect like any significant response from the ASEAN as we see from the coup, since the coup until today, right? So the countries have been engaging with junta since the coup, like Cambodia, Laos will continue to engage with the military junta. As Amaël also earlier mentioned, probably they will also send the observers to observe the elections and then provide a rubber stamp to this so-called election. And at the other hand, the countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines who've been opposing and then trying to bring some, like their accountability to the discussion also will behave in the same way. At the same time, the Thailand has been managing, like a quite complex relationship with Myanmar. We see some of the Thai authorities like the military and then some of the government authorities being very much cooperative to the Myanmar military junta since the coup. At the same time, the local governments been engaging with the other mechanisms like NUG, NUCC, or the other civil society. So that will be continue. We can see that the continuation is the same behavior from Thailand as well. I think, but we have to recognize the situation today. Myanmar is quite different, but we have seen from 2010 or 2013. So back then, we remember 2010 elections, the SAM elections that the junta staged. So the situation in the country is no longer the same. So the military has much lower territorial control, and at the same time, they have a very weakened relationship with the ethnic minority groups. So this really shows the limited the capacity that and the control the junta has over their territory. I think that's something ASEAN and in international community should look at. Also, we have seen under the ASEAN chairmanship under the Malaysia. So it's been quite clear their message election is not the priority right now, especially since the junta has failed to deliver the 5-point consensus that ASEAN leaders agreed in Jakarta just after the military coup in 2021. However, looking ahead, we also know the Philippines is going to be the next ASEAN chair. we think that the Philippines, under their chairmanship, continue to pressure to uphold the commitments while also engaging with the oppositions group like NUCC that represent the people of Myanmar. The Manila also provide their support the regional pushes to ceasefire and then the humanitarian aid when it comes to Myanmar. But pro-junta member states like Laos, Cambodia, as I mentioned earlier, like to have very bold moves, because we know when it comes to every decision in ASEAN, the political consensus is very much important. So without those, the consensus, it's very much hard for ASEAN to take a bold move on Myanmar, right?
Thank you for that response, Tharindu. And I'll just take a moment here to mention that the Frontier Myanmar Political Insider newsletter sent out on Sunday was on this very topic, ASEAN's election dilemma. It was written by Nick Dunlop and Joseph Young, and it also argues that given ASEAN's conflicting approaches and its insistence on non-interference, it's hard to see a significant change leading to meaningful pressure on the military, let alone any tangible results resolving the political crisis. Of course, Political Insider newsletters are sent every 2 weeks to Frontier Myanmar members. Now, Tharindu, easy question. What can we expect from ANFREL before these elections? What's coming up in future from you?
We will continue to engage with the civil society and to advocate on this, the regional and then the repercussions as Asia and then the ASEAN will face through this controversial election. And then we also will conduct some regional dialogue to bring the stakeholders to discuss about those regional repercussions that, the region will face at the end of the day through this kind of elections.
And once again, congratulations on putting out this report. It's really structured in a very clear way and is very helpful for understanding each of the aspects of these so-called elections. Now, there's also something else in there, though, which is about the moral aspects of these so-called elections. Amaël, maybe you can finish us off by commenting on that. Thanks.
For me, one of the key points in the report and in our assessment, it's not just that these elections will not comply with international standards, which I think is not really news to a lot of people. We have documented it. We have developed a systematic approach to help with advocacy. But another core point is quite simply that these elections will increase the violence and people are actively being killed by the junta, as the junta is pushing through airstrikes and military offensives in places where they want to stage elections. These elections are not just technically an issue, they're also morally just an issue. It's indefensible what the junta is doing. Attacking your own population to pursue political legitimacy on the world stage is really something that strays so far out of acceptable realm of democratic elections that we really want to highlight that.
Yeah, and as we heard at the top of the episode this week, is just another example of that. Awful. Okay, well, thank you very much, Tharindu and Amaël from ANFREL, for coming on to What's Happening in Myanmar. Hope to have you on the show again if you ever do something like this again.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for the opportunity again.
And thank you, listeners, for keeping up with What's Happening in Myanmar for another week. Remember, you can email the show. Frontier Myanmar, its journalists and other employees love to hear from you. WHI Myanmar@proton.me. That's the address. Until next time, take care and farewell.